Hello, everyone. Today on the Yours Truly podcast, I'm conversing with Brendan Graham Dempsey. I bumped into Brendan a few days ago on YouTube when Algo fed me up his dialogue with Jordan Hall, which was captivating to behold. A day or two later, I took in his conversation with Paul Vanderklay, both men who I have had the privilege of following and interacting with here in this little corner of the internet. Brendan had 2 follow-up videos to each of those conversations, respectively, that I found captivating. He even engaged one of my comments on the Paul Vanderklay follow-up. I reached out to Brendan on Twitter, and he graciously agreed to do some conversation craft. I dug around on his channel a little, but not too much, in hopes we can capture honest dialogue and achieve understanding from each other in real time. From the digging I did do, I found that he studied at Yale Divinity School, runs a retreat center in Vermont called Sky Meadow Retreat, is currently writing a book and developing Sky Meadow Institute, and of course is operating his YouTube channel entitled Brendan Graham Dempsey. So without further delay, let's begin a conversation with Brendan. Hi, this is Christian Baxter, and you're listening to Yours Truly, a place we go to think out loud. All right, we got the red light going.
Hey,
Brendan, so yeah, it's good to meet you.
good to meet you too.
And you kind of bumped into a little subculture on YouTube with those videos of that I talked about earlier with Jordan Hall and Paul Vanderklay. And what was that experience like for you?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks so much for inviting me onto your podcast. This is great, and appreciate it. Appreciate you reaching out. And this was really what kind of the sort of thing I was hoping would happen from trying to bridge some of these different subcultures, conversation spaces, little corners is just like more conversation like this and all that. So I'm excited for this. Yeah. In terms of like how that happened, I mean, I've been very aware of this little corner for a while. I've been very aware of folks adjacent to that space. I mean, I've been in sort of the meta-modern conversation for the past few years, and there's a lot of overlap, so obviously John Vervaeke is a big figure, I would say, in both of these different scenes, and Jordan Hall apparently likewise. And then there's like, in sort of the grand Venn diagram, there's sort of like stuff that is in one camp and not the other sort of a thing. And so I've been aware of, Jonathan Pageau's work. I've obviously been aware of Peterson and for years. I mean, in many ways, he was sort of the cultural juggernaut phenomenon that kind of in that wake of that whole thing, led to a lot of these kinds of conversations, both in their content and their form, right? Like the idea of long form conversations about things that matter didn't seem possible before all that stuff started happening. So anyway, I was kind of aware of the scene for a little bit and a little bit aware of Paul's work, but it didn't quite seem, I don't know how to say, like the right time, or, I kind of figured eventually that these two circles would overlap more and come in more contact with each other, at least as I'm relating to folks. But now with these recent conversions and Jordan Hall's conversion, and you mentioned my conversation with him, and I think this sort of pivot into more kind of traditional religious conversation and that whole thing that's happening, I think it's a good opportunity for us to be engaging more directly. And so I'm excited. So I really enjoyed the conversation with Paul. I'm sure we can talk more about that. We will. But I think it's just kind of the beginning of something special and fun and interesting, and something, there will be these sort of dialectical tensions involved. I look forward to kind of exploring that and seeing, what the contours are and whatnot.
Well, that's what this feels like to me.
Yeah.
I mean, and so hopefully the same. And because I said, I'm a Christian when I contacted you, and the other piece of that, I guess the way I want to try to start this conversation is a little bit of like get to know you. I was actually looking at some videos that you'd done, some podcasts, and they started to go into your like a more dialogue and story. I was like, actually, I just want to hear it from him.
Sure.
Like instead of trying to do this thing, and I can share some stuff about where I'm coming from, but like, so like, who are you? How did you kind of get to this place? You know, more on the personal, less on the like academic journey. I would say.
Yeah, and I'll just note too, because in the conversation with Paul, that was sort of where we ended. Because
Right.
you know, of sort of like, so I will be talking as well with Paul about this, and hopefully won't repeat myself too much. But yeah, let's get into it here. Yeah, I grew up in a very Christian household, in a evangelical Christian context, and actually, it's funny in in Jordan Hall's video, one of them he was talking, maybe it was with Jim Rutt. He talked about part of his whole conversion experience being at this church and then this Christian university called Montreat in North Carolina. And when I heard that, I was like, oh my gosh, that's where my parents met and got
Interesting.
married. So yeah, both my parents were converts to Christianity and then went to Montreat and so anyway, yeah, I was raised in a kind of, well, it was Assemblies of God church, so kind of a Pentecostal charismatic tradition, and in Vermont, which is an interesting kind of dynamic because Vermont is a kind of secular place, and so there was a sort of, it was a sense in which, I think some people probably, when they are in a Christian context, it feels kind of like the water that they are, like fish in water sort of a thing. It's just like the air you breathe. But if you're part of a very Christian, subculture in a broader secular culture, it, I think, creates a certain different way that you think about yourself and the faith, because it is much more sort of, it defines itself against the world. And so a lot of the aspect of the tradition of the early church of sort of thinking of itself and very legitimately being this sort of like countercultural movement and this sort of, this sort of on the margins kind of identity is something that is sort of the lens that I had on that, and got a sense that the world, is very fallen and messed up, but we're part of this sort of very small, close-knit Christian community. And so anyway, that was, I'm sure, a big part of what informed my perspective young. But yeah, I mean, I there's a lot that I could say about all the kind of childhood experience with Christianity and the faith, and it's almost a little, overwhelming to think about even where to start with all that. But so we could dig into any of that you want, but
let me
yeah,
start there with
Sure.
So my first 10 years of life was in a charismatic, like Assembly of God, Pentecostal adjacent, non-denom setting,
yeah,
then into Southern Baptist. And so like saw lots of things, experienced lots of dispensational culture.
Mm-hmm.
And even like when you're pointing about that being in Vermont versus, say, I'm from Arkansas or the South, like it's more, I'm still in the water versus to a degree, where it sounds like from up there, you were already like us against the world type thing. So yeah, just saying there's a resonance point there. So yeah, keep going.
Yeah, cool. And yeah, I'd like to know about you too. So, let's make it this very much a dialogue, and, wherever there are points of contact here or things you want to dig in on. It's a little bit, difficult to kind of just, I don't know, speak about yourself, but,
It's all right.
yeah,
We're talking story. We're talking story. It's okay.
talking story. Yeah. So, gosh, I mean, I guess maybe just on like some things, maybe we could relate on this. I'm not sure. I mean, when were you, if you're willing to say, when were you born? What?
85.
85. Okay. So I was 89. So
Okay.
there's probably some good overlap here. But there's this sort of like very much a part of evangelical pop culture, like DC Talk and Audio Adrenaline and all like the music, and,
Yeah.
yeah, like, gosh, what else? I mean, Newsboys, all that stuff. That was very big. And growing up, like going to, especially as I got into like youth group age and all that stuff, going to like the youth conventions that would happen, you know, where there was like the whole, you'd all come together with the music and the altar calls and all that stuff.
Yep.
Yeah, that was very much kind of the religious world I was in. and yeah, so what happened, I think, was that I took this all, very seriously, in the sense that, like, if you have a sense of what ultimate reality is, right? If this is what is real, if this is what is important, then I'm the sort of person who just like throws myself into what I think is most important. So I felt like, as I was coming into sort of high school age, I had a very kind of deep connection that moved me from a kind of relationship with my faith, which is very kind of, familial, into something very personal, kind of like, I adopt this, I got baptized, I was reading my Bible a lot, etc. And then it was around that time where I thought, well, if this is what matters most, then I should like kind of devote my life to this.
Mm-hmm.
So I toyed with becoming a pastor, but ultimately I felt like, no, I should become a teacher of Bible at like a Christian seminary, let's say. And so that was my kind of trajectory, starting kind of early high school, let's say. And so that's when I started kind of getting into the study of this stuff in kind of a I don't know, like a
Intentional,
yeah. I mean, there's also something that happens around 12, 13, I think, for a lot of people, where they become very intentional about like their ideas and their worldview, and they want to like make things their own. And so I think it's very common for people to be like, well, if I am of a religion, then I'm going to like really look into this thing. And so I did that. Right. But in retrospect, I realized I did that also from like a very kind of predetermined outcome sort of way. I was like, well, I'm going to look into those other religions too. And so, found a couple things on Buddhism, and I was like, that's not real and that's stupid, sort of thing. So that was part of an early kind of look into stuff beyond my kind of immediate sphere of thought. But I will say I got very perturbed by doubt, all sorts of doubts, really beginning in kind of middle school, but growing into high school. And so this led me to apologetics, which I was very into for a while. So the work of like Josh McDowell, and who were some other folks? I mean, he was a big one. I don't know if you know his stuff, but like
I went to a conference, man.
Oh, really?
Like,
okay.
Well, you and I are tracking. Like I know where they kind of, because I know my story. I know where they kind of diverge, but you and I are tracking like very.
Well, tell me some of your story.
Same thing. Early high school, 15, had a very personal spiritual encounter. Okay, now I'm really a Christian. I'd been baptized when I was 7 from conversation with my parents, but then I was like, no, this is it. This is mine. This is me taking hold,
Right.
We were basically only allowed to listen to Christian music. Every artist you mentioned was in my CD case. And then same kind of thing. Well, this is really serious. And then about a year after, I thought that I was supposed to maybe do like ministry. I had actually another encounter that I consider very mystical, hard to explain, that led me to that. But I was getting into music at the time, because I ended up being a worship pastor for like 15 years. Well, for 10 years, but doing it for like 15, and so, but that was like the beginning of that journey was in high school.
Yeah.
But had a good close group of friends, a guy or two, and like, okay, are we Calvinists? Oh, what is this? Oh, these words, and let's like start thinking. Yeah. And then I went to a Bible college. Well, it's a liberal arts college that's a Christian university now, and then studied biblical studies. And
cool. Okay.
And so that's like, I got that in my undergrad, and so like it sounds like you were kind of headed in that direction too. So we're definitely like tracking there.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's really fascinating. Yeah, I mean, like, you remind me of the whole, like, things that you could listen to. That was like a big thing growing up, that there was this, like, all these attempts made to like try to filter out so much about, sort of the outside world in a way. And it was attempted very diligently, but it things always got through the cracks, so to speak.
Yeah, Red Hot Chili Peppers made it through.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so that's its own whole thing. I mean, it's also maybe worth mentioning. I don't know. My upbringing was also a little strange in this regard, that I never went to the same school for more than a year at a time.
Oh wow!
But also for no reason, meaning like my family never moved. We stayed in the same place the whole time, but just for circumstantial reasons, like, oh, there's a good teacher here this year, or I didn't like the school this year, so I cycled between homeschooled like a private Christian small school and public school, and so that was another kind of interesting layer to I also got some of the very much a kind of evangelical Christian education, elementary school with like a Becca books and this like that kind of thing. And so, yeah, I'm sure also that's another element that plays into some of my perspective on things, of just like kind of going through this rotation of like hopping into like different cultural worldview situations, and like navigating that and always feeling, kind of on the outs in every context that I was a part of.
Yeah.
So anyway, so at around 15 myself, start reading a lot of stuff and getting interested in these questions. And I was remembering this because it came up for me like in a really potent way, largely out of the Paul Vanderklayk convo, is I remember getting on the internet and finding myself in this like chat forum or someplace, where someone was like playing the role of the like atheist, trying to like, tell everyone why Christianity was wrong. And they were like saying all these historical facts about it. And so I'm in this chat room and I'm in my full on apologetics, evangelizing mode sort of a thing. So I'm like, well, I'll tell this guy a thing or two, like, so we would have these long exchanges going back on these forums where, he would say something and then I'd, rejoinder with some philosophical claim or something. But what struck me was that the kind of stuff he was bringing into the conversation, I had absolutely no knowledge of. So he would say things about like the book of Isaiah, and he'd be like, and we know that, in Isaiah 11:7, that's referring to the son of King Hezekiah, and that this word doesn't actually mean virgin, it means maiden or this or that. And, and then when we see that this actually is different from Deutero Isaiah, which was written, in the Babylonian captivity. And I'm like, what does this stuff mean? Right. Like I had no reference point for any of this. Like all I knew was, the Gospels, and I'd read the New Testament and stuff, but like here was all this like ancient Israelite history that I had no understanding of. So
all the source criticism.
Yeah, I mean, no, go on.
Well, and that maps onto like the part where in your story. So this is what was interesting to me because you brought that out. I watched, I guess it was the response to Jordan Hall where you went through like kind of a I think you call it scriptural devotional versus like historical critical views.
Yeah.
And I was given those. In one of the comments I mentioned, our professors like gave us Luke Timothy Johnson, which you kind of like knocked down a little bit on our comments, but I was like, we walked through the Jesus seminar, we walked through the different sources, and it was in a very safe environment for Christians, and from what it sounded like for me, when you really, or at least that's starting when you're like in high school, and then something I guess led you into like Yale Divinity, which I have an interesting connection there on that too. But, I was given all that stuff, and for me, it didn't land as in a troubling way, I guess you could say. Yeah. And, our church history professor, he actually gave us, our textbook was written by an atheist. It was a church history textbook by atheists, and he wanted us to just dialogue. It wasn't even like a intense thing, but he's like, well, how would you write, do 4 essays this semester as we go through like dialoguing with the author of this, history book. And so I kind of, like I said, it wasn't like I wasn't introduced to that, but I also had this other, for me, like the deepest meaning really was like, how does this work with the piano, with the worship thing, so I think that would be why it didn't land. But the new atheism, which was built on a lot of that, that did land. That created a lot more insecurity in my faith, like during that time, like during the next,
Like the Dawkins and Harris stuff.
yeah,
and all
like
that?
oh five to,
Yeah.
14 or 12 or so, something like that,
Yeah.
So that would be where they have. So what about for you? When did that start? So that started to kind of shake things up a little bit with
Yeah.
the
So
chat.
well, so this is actually really interesting, and I might actually do, I don't know, some video on this or something, because so I first started exploring the biblical, scholarship as it pertained to the Old Testament. Sorry, there's a fly here. I got him. Sorry.
It's all right. This is so low key. It's cool.
So I started studying, the Old Testament through the lens of well, that's not how I would have thought about it. For whatever reason, I remember I got Richard Elliott Friedman's Who Wrote the Bible, which is a book about the documentary hypothesis. And I read that, and this would have been probably getting into my junior year of high school, maybe even at this point my senior year. But that was just like really revelatory, because like, what he laid out there was just like, oh, but here's the point I wanted to make, though, is that I think that by coming in through the Old Testament, something kind of clicked with me in a way that didn't seem threatening by using this methodology, right? Because at least in the tradition I was raised in, and I'm sure it's like this broadly, maybe in your tradition as well, but there's this sense, right, that like, well, the Old Testament, like that's the Old Testament, and like God's doing different things, and it's a different kind of thing happening there. But with
Different
the New
covenant.
Testament, exactly, and so there was just this sense that that God was stricter and kind of meaner, and all the and whereas with the New Testament you get the love and the mercy of Jesus and the personability and like the real beauty and all that stuff. So that was just part of the kind of theological framework that I was operating in. That by the time I started reading this stuff, I'd actually already developed a lot of like ethical quandaries around the Old Testament, right? Like the conquest of Canaan, right? And gosh, what else? Stuff in the laws, about slavery and gender roles, a lot of stuff that was like whatever. And so I had these kind of hangups about that going on. And I also remember like when I went to go read the Old Testament and was working through that, and there's this moment, where like basically there's the whole Exodus and everything, and yes, Moses has met with God in the in the cave with the burning bush and all that, but finally now there's Mount Sinai, and then finally there's this like climactic moment where Moses like is direct with God and about to like receive this divine revelation that's like God speaking directly to man that will blah blah blah, and the next verse is like, when you make an ablution sacrifice, make sure that the incense, and like then it just went on with these lists, and I was like, oh man, that's a little bit of a anticlimactic, a little bit of a disappointment thing there, and I felt like there was just this like a kind of legalistic kind of very kind of this stuff that comprised a lot of the law that you get in that Old Testament, like it didn't speak to me, and it kind of was a hang up that I had, right? So long story short, I had these kind of theological things that were sitting with me. And so when I encountered the historical critical stuff, it actually helped with that, right? Because now instead of like reading this and be like, oh, this is Moses writing these books for all of, prosperity, what's the word I'm looking for? Not prosperity, for all of posterity. And communicating this grand vision, it was sort of like, oh no, yeah, it was written by a bunch of people over time, and so it kind of took the pressure off a little bit. And then all these ethical problems were like, well, yeah, this wasn't an actual direct communication from God to Moses saying go do all these things. This was a historical moment where people were trying to make sense of what God wanted, and they were culturally bound by their conceptions of the divine, and so they thought all this was good and okay, but we know that it's not. So actually, ironically, yeah, the historical critical stuff was like freed up a lot of theological hangups that I had by making it kind of human, all too human, if that makes sense, right? But then implicit in that was this sense that, well, but when we get to the New Testament, that's where God really speaks, essentially, right? Like that's where it's different. And so, long and short of it, and I could go through all the details, but I don't know how much you or your audience will be interested. But you know, by the time I got to college, and I double majored in classical civilizations and religious studies, and the classics part was for learning the Greek and the languages part. And when I got to college, then I started taking a lot of classes and on my own terms, just reading a lot of the scholarship and reading a bunch of stuff. And that was when I got into historical Jesus studies, and that was when the entire methodology that I'd found so much insight from applied to the Old Testament got applied to the New Testament, and it similarly disrupted the account, let's say. And that was what really caused the faith issue. Because like I could for a long time be like, but the Old Testament, that's different, but the New Testament. And when I couldn't do that with the New Testament, and it brought up all these issues with the New Testament, but at that point it was too late. I couldn't just say, this is just stupid historical critical stuff, right? Because I could see
you'd already kind of accepted, integrated that and accepted that, yeah.
And it had already, I would feel like, kind of proven its worth as a set of sort of sense-making, meaning-making tools for understanding reality. So then when, the insights of the historical critical stuff applied to the New Testament came in, I felt compelled to kind of accept these findings, but it was profoundly dissonant because, because this was, just briefly, this is Jesus as apocalyptic prophet, right? Basically false apocalyptic prophet, someone who thought the world was going to end imminently and then it didn't. So that creates a big theological problem. And then of course, at this point, having tracked the apocalypticism aspect of Christianity into the New Testament and seeing how fundamentally kind of apocalyptic it is in nature, having to grapple with that, right? Being like, well, but then Christian history went on for 2,000 more years, and the end of the world still hasn't come, and and create a lot of things. So anyway, I'll pause there. But that was where things started to really.
So that was in your undergrad, but you still decided to go to I guess, did you go directly to Yale after that, or was
then there's a whole thing that happens. But I want to. I mean, if you wanted to,
I guess, I don't have a whole lot. I don't know if I want to start the conversation yet about because you talked about, so I'm just going to say it. So you talked about sense making, meaning making, and this is coming up against a personal meaning crisis for yourself.
Yeah.
So that those.
Well, maybe I can finish that story, then we can get into the.
Sure.
I don't mean to interrupt you. I wasn't sure if there was anything. So maybe just briefly, I will just finish the biographical stuff, and then we can get into the the other aspect of this, or the more general aspect of this, because but no. To your question. And by the way, I'm really sorry. I hope you weren't making a point and I interrupted you.
I don't think so. No, okay. I kind of want to see. I want to figure out that part of your journey. Specific, the deconstruction story.
Yeah.
I mean, and then I'll kind of, if it lands right, I'll kind of go into kind of how that played out in my life in a way.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So So then, in my junior year of college, I'm reading all this stuff, and I actually was writing. I was going to graduate early, so I took this senior level seminar in my junior year and decided to write this thesis, which became my monograph. Which was about tracing kind of apocalyptic mythological motifs from the ancient Near East into Jewish and then Christian apocalypticism, and then into the Gospel of Mark. And so by this point in my senior year, I was in full on having to grapple with the implications of all the historical critical stuff around the New Testament, and grappling with the findings that a lot of the the letters purported to be by the disciples weren't by the disciples, that letters, purported to be by Paul weren't by Paul. What does that mean if people are saying that they are people and they're not? Like, what? And then, of course, the Gospels, if they're not written by eyewitness testimony, which is what I'd been told in the apologetic stuff of like, oh yeah, this is solid, take it to the bank. And then, just all that stuff, right, really hit. And it was like, oh no. On top of all this, two things are happening, crumbling simultaneously, which is I feel like I'm losing my faith. So my whole kind of center of the world is falling apart. But then this is also supposed to be my career path, right? So this is my whole thing of like, I was going to become a Bible professor, and now what? And on top of that, I'd gotten engaged to a young woman also in the kind of evangelical community, and our faith was an important part of that story. And so I'm kind of staring down the barrel of all this simultaneously and not knowing what to do. And, going home and trying to talk to family and friends and even my pastor about it, but not finding very receptive audiences, so to speak. And actually deeply, like probably, just like deeply psychologically hurtful things that show up in that context, right? Because you bring something home and you're like, I don't know what to do with this. And then someone's like, I don't know what to do with it either. It must be false, and just reject it. Your atheist professors just don't believe it. And it's like, well, it's not that. It's like, I find this compelling. And it's like, well, you got to have faith. And it's like, well, that's not really much of an answer. And then as you start to kind of do this more and more, people say, oh, well, poor Brendan, I guess he never had faith. He was never a Christian, because people can't fall away from the true way, right? So like this whole thing that you've devoted your life to, you're now being told like you were never even in that. And so that was just so heartbreaking and disturbing and upsetting.
Like part of me just wants to pause. I mean, I don't know how you've dealt with that personally, but that's a lot. Like everything you just said right there is like, it's like, it's kind of bringing up some emotion inside of me, because I know what it's like to have your whole world basically, and it's even, you could even say in that situation, there may have been parts of you that felt like it was your fault or something. I don't know if that's true. That was definitely true for me. And I'm not saying that is true for you, but we do things psychologically ourselves sometimes, but like just that kind of radical undoing is incredibly intense. Yeah. So like, I don't know. And I have my own relationship to that in my own life, which I guess I'll insert here, which
by all means
was, from high school till 2016, I graduated in 03, so I was doing this modern worship stuff, kind of in the Southern Baptist world. But I was a part of a non-denominational church that was, they had appreciation for church history. They accepted alien immersion. We ended up hiring a Presbyterian pastor who actually went to Yale Divinity School. I worked with him for 5 years, was at church with him for 10 years. So it was kind of this liminal space in which we'll get into that part of the conversation later. That's one I want to get to with the metamodern Christianity. But in my own life, I ended up betraying like my vows, and I was married to like my high school sweetheart, and betrayed the trust of the church through all that. So my identity, for my reputation, my career, my vocation, gone.
Wow.
And that was my fault. And so that was my meaning crisis.
Yeah.
And going from when I talked about the new atheism thing, and this is where I also have questions about like truth, like the epistemological kind of questions about that with you, because when I was trying to like on this journey of like, is what I believe true, in a similar way to you, listening to John Lennox and Richard Dawkins debate, all the old earth, young earth, blah, 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 all these things, and, biblical accuracy. I was like, well, if I can know that, then I can like stand on that and believe it's true. So that was the journey. But not the whole time, but in certain ways, like in my life, there was not a truth. Like in my life, there was never really grappling with being a truthful person. And then that ultimately resulted in, like that cheating on my wife. And so then I was like, well, and then the way that I circled back to understanding truth was through being a truthful person. And that happened through actually another kind of like, super, I don't know the word that's going to like really land with you. I don't know, supernatural, metaphysical, mystical,
sublime.
Yeah, I had something flash through my mind that helped me. It was actually a vision of Abraham's dagger coming down, because the only thing I was trying to hold on to was my family. Like, if I can control this narrative, even though I've already been fired, even though then I can, but when I let go of that and had like a complete ego death and had, that is when I came in a really profound contact with a part of what truth means, versus not only are these things, did they actually happen, and that's true, but what does it mean to be a truthful person? So I don't know, that was my meaning crisis.
There's so much. No, go on, sorry.
Well, and so then, and that was 7.5 years ago. I've been doing YouTube for like 3 months. This is just another stage in healing. There's been reconciliation. There's been lots of healing with myself, my family, community, church. Ended up going back to that church that happened, I was a pastor at 6 months later, and just like attended for 6 years, didn't do anything. So, anyways, and you had actually mentioned at the end of maybe your last video, you were like interested in talking to like theologians or historians, but you also mentioned practitioners. I don't know if you remember that.
Sure,
and I do consider myself like that. I come at this from a heavy form of Christian practicing with the worship thing. So that's kind of also an angle. But yeah, so that's the quick version of meaning crisis for me. And that was, I've gone into that so many times on this channel. I don't want to like delve into it as much, but to kind of meet you there.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, thanks for sharing that. And yeah, I mean, I hear you. I definitely hear that. So yeah, you get it, just like the whole world, falling apart. And, there's this scene that Nietzsche writes about with the madman, right? Where he goes out and I seek God, all this stuff. And it's this scene where he talks about the death of God. And the idea of the death of God, then he compares to just falling through infinite space. There's no up, there's no down. And it's just this vertiginous, like, what? Which I think captures that phenomenological experience of like your world falling apart, and just literally, I don't know, here's where the academic in me could come out, because like studying Mircea Eliade and the comparative religious stuff, like you get a framing for the framing, you get a framing for how people make frames about things, right? And like how we make worlds, and like when your world breaks open, that's like your whole container for how to make sense of everything, and how to orient yourself, and how to assess what's valuable and what you even want to do or should do with your life. And then if that kind of blows up, you're just like totally adrift. And so, that's kind of the experience. So, I experienced that very profoundly. And, in my case, ultimately concluded, well, I can't continue on this trajectory and be truthful, let's say, right? And I think that what you named is actually something really important, because like people can get the like propositional aspect, I think, a lot about anything really, about whether it's a worldview or I don't know, just claims about reality. But like, it's not, I think, until you're sort of forced to, like, how do I say this? There's something about this moment that we're talking about, this sort of kairos, where you have to be just true to yourself, I guess, for lack of a better term, because there's so much pressure to do otherwise, right? And if you're part of a world and you feel like there's like all these cracks in your version of it, in some ways it could be just a lot easier to just like ignore that, to keep trying to be part of the world and just, keep saying the right thing. But there's also this truthfulness that has to come out of like, this doesn't work for me anymore. I can't do this anymore. And I can't be this thing that I can't truthfully affirm or assent to. It doesn't have to be that you know what you need to be. In fact, it's a profound ignorance of that, but I can't do this. And it's sort of like there's something about a kind of, like truthful integrity about that, even as things are falling apart, that sort of pushes you out of where you would like to be and into something else. And I just want to name that too. And so part of, for me, my story was I had to say, this whole trajectory I was on can't be my future, with integrity. I can't, yeah. So that
with the
led
relationship,
to me,
with your
so the relationship, we broke off our engagement,
man.
and I didn't go on to divinity school yet, and I'll get back to that. And things just kind of went to hell. So that was the situation that I was in when I graduated. And so instead of going on, I then had to figure out what I was going to do. So here's the in-between period. Was what I wound up doing was moving into an artist collective, this like bohemian artist collective in Burlington, Vermont, of a bunch of people who were like, basically like obsessed with aesthetics and art and the glory of art and like art as a worldview. I don't know if you've ever read any Kierkegaard, but he writes about, the aesthete. And this was full on the aesthete stuff. And so for the next 4 years, I really threw myself into this. So I was working through a lot of stuff over the course of that period, and I'm living in this little closet next to a kitchen, like in a little spice rack area in this like bohemian artist collective. And I'm, I've turned my bed into like a Grecian temple. And I've like got all these like, I've become obsessed with like old books, but I basically just spent this like 4 years trying to read as much as I possibly could, like read all of the canon, like whatever that means, So like I read all of like Greek tragedy and all of Shakespeare, and, like I was going to the tea house every day wearing a frock coat, like, translating Homer from the Greek and stuff, and just devoting myself to this kind of like, the ideal of the Renaissance, aesthetic dandy man or something. And this was like, in retrospect, I see that this was this kind of move of like trying to find a center, trying to find something that like could cohere a kind of orientation. Because now if it's like, well, there's no God and there's no, like what did Dostoevsky say, right? If there is no God, then everything's permitted or something, right? Like how do you assess anything then? And the only thing I could assent to was that, well, some things feel good. Some things, like there's an aesthetic component to existence that can't be doubted. So I was looking for some kind of like foundation to life in art. And so I did that for a while, and that's its own part of the story. But during this period, I was working through a lot of, just, reading a lot of Nietzsche for one thing. So like working through all that, and just kind of grappling with the nihilism, with the atheism, with like, what is value? What is beauty? And, what is the nature of society? And like, what's up? Why is everything so ugly now? And what's happened to civilization? And all these sorts of questions, which may or may not seem linked in the minds of your audience, but for me, we're profoundly linked in all this. And so
I think it probably is. It probably is.
And then the big thing for me during this whole period was, I wasn't just reading, I was writing. So I had experienced what I felt to be personally like a death of God experience, like this loss of meaning, this meaning crisis. And what I then set out to do is write an epic of the death of God. I wanted to write an epic poem on that theme. I was, well, again, I have to tell this in broad brushstrokes here, but this was basically the thing. So I spent 4 years trying to work through this issue. And one of the things about epic as a genre is that the speaker of the poem goes into the underworld. So the whole first part of this book that I write is this poem about the death of God. There's a war in heaven, and then God is overthrown, and he goes into the underworld. But then I realized that this character has to go into the underworld and needs to kind of confront God in the underworld. And so through the process, a 4-year process of writing this poem, it winds up sort of like being this sort of psychological catharsis in which I, as the speaker, kind of go down into the underworld and find like the shade or the, ghost of God, and like, haggle things out, and like with the goal of trying to bring some sense of the divine back to the world. Because I also knew that like, we can't live without religion. We can't live without spirituality. We can't live without God. Nihilism doesn't work. hedonism doesn't work, aestheticism doesn't work, that the role for the sacred is absolutely essential, and yet it seemed like collectively we've gone through this death of God crisis, and we need to have a kind of re-enchantment of the world. We need to have some kind of re-sacralization of reality. And so what does that look like? And so that was what that poem for me was forcing me to kind of confront, was like, well, what does that look like and how does it happen and all of that. So finishing up my story so we can move on to other things, I wrote this poem and I got to the other side of these questions in a meaningful way. And I had some of my own kind of profound mystical experiences that were part of this, but the main message that really hit home was that God dies, but God gets reborn. And this is what God does. This is the process by which the divine has always worked in history. You could say sacred history, and that, as I talked about in that sort of metamodern Christianity video I did, like, you can understand this progression of this evolution of the relationship between God and man as a series of death of God concepts and the rebirth of a new one, I guess you could say, is that God is sort of being transformed in the process of relationship with humanity, and humanity being participatory in that process. And in many ways, that's what the prophets were doing, right? Is giving people a new God concept and being like, no, this isn't about idols. This isn't about, sacred prostitution or whatever. This is about something very different, right? And Jesus coming along and saying something very similar, like, no, you've got it wrong. God doesn't work like
deeper.
that. Yeah, exactly. It's deeper. And so seeing this as a sort of unfolding process, and I realized that, ultimately that meant that my God concept had to die, and I needed to have a kind of resurrection of a new sense of the sacred. But so did the world. So does the world, right? I feel like we're still living with an outmoded, maybe even dead concept, God concept. We need this resurrection to occur at the kind of historical collective level. And so for me, this was just a profound calling of like, this is what, it is. I mean, it's right. That's what God does in the prophetic tradition, is he finds people to kind of speak to a new way of being in the world. There's a new way to be human.
I'll switch for it. Got you.
And so anyway, what I gleaned from all this was basically, so there's this moment in the poem where, there's this resurrection of the divine, and there's this grand kaleidoscopic eye that, it's a mystical vision of this new God concept and all this stuff. And so then I thought, okay, well, this is what people do. Or what we can do, and this is what God is calling for in this historical moment, let's say. And the way to do that is through putting out new words, new ideas, new symbols, new images into the culture, right? Vervaeke talks about stealing the culture. We've got to steal the culture, but we need a new God concept. And I know that there are different ways this can land for people. It can sound like I'm saying that people need to create God in a different way. You can interpret it that way, but I think you can also very much interpret it as God is calling people to transform people's understanding of God as well. And so there is a way of understanding this whole sort of evolution as something in that way. So that was when I realized the importance that art can have, the divine utilization of the aesthetic. That aesthetics are important, not as an end unto themselves, but you could say in service to the good and the true, right? And so so that was what then precipitated me reaching out to do a master's degree at Yale Divinity School, which I found a program called Religion and the Arts there. And that seemed to be perfect. And I looked at the faculty, and people like Christian Wyman and others were there. So it seemed like this was a place where I could pursue that angle to things. So I did wind up going to the Divinity School in the end. It just took this long period of figuring out what exactly it is that I was actually supposed to do as part of this picture. And what I started out thinking, I had a different role to play, and now ended with a very different one. So
Well,
yeah, that's that's basically the end of that story.
because he said the aesthetic, something like pointing to the true and the good, but I mean that's a beautiful story. I mean, it has its versions of tragedy, has its versions of redemption, and now plotting that path. I mean, we've kind of you've been I don't know if the word's gracious, but you've like stayed in the Christian frame pretty. But I know, listening to a few of your videos and obviously the conversations you had with Paul and with Jordan, I'm going to tell you how I experienced. We'll jump to those now, and I want to tell you how I experienced that.
Sure.
In contrast, and what I think I'm coming to understand as a metamodern Christianity versus metamodern religion. So so the way it hits me is at this point, I think you are seeing use the word divine then as and it's more of a universal truth, like you would integrating like all the major religions or something. How can we get past the modern and then the postmodern that then collapses on itself to this thing? Is that accurate with everybody? Or
yeah, I mean, so you're asking like just briefly like what I would see as a metamodern Christianity or metamodern religion?
Religion. Yeah, that and so does that kind of describe?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's how would I say? What you said, right? That there's this element of the other traditions playing a role here. That there's some aspects of the different traditions that are speaking to something true and universal as well. And then there are also elements of those traditions that are just speaking to something maybe more narrow, local, cultural, parochial.
Like in how to transcend that. It feels like, from what I gathered from the little bit that I did, that your project feels like, how do we transcend like that whole level? Like we're at this space where, your truth is your truth, and then that all collapses.
Yeah.
And then how do we get to that higher form of consciousness type thing? And I guess I would, obviously, as someone who claims Christ and the Christian story as truth, and we can get into all those words too, but like, I'm trying to make sure that I understand that is kind of a little bit of the vision of a metamodern religion.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's all about being clear really what we mean by this, because there are all sorts of ways that people can try to gesture towards like some kind of universal, syncretistic religious project or something, and those can be terrible too, right? There's all sorts of new age elements of like, we can just take from any tradition we want and make some kind of Franken religion or something. So that's one way that can happen. So it's a very specific mode, I think, of thinking in terms of the different stages of the different cultural epochs, the different insights that are brought to bear from different. Here's a way of thinking about it: the structures of thinking, right? So each religion has content. But each religion can also be thought of as exhibiting different structures in different contexts. For example, right? If you look at the form that let's just call it like traditional devotional Christianity takes, and you look at how like traditional devotional Buddhism takes, there's a lot of structural similarities there, right? What do I mean by that, right? Like there's a sense of there's some kind of revered text, and that these texts are attributing or are articulating a certain kind of traditional wisdom that's been handed down, that goes back, that has a sort of ultimate value and ultimate reality to it, and that there's often a sense that there are supernatural phenomena, miracles, and non-naturalistic things that happen. Ritual is very important, etc. Okay, just use some examples, right? And you can find forms of that with traditional Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, etc. But then if you think about, like, let's say modern Christianity, well, what does that look like? Well, there you've got, Christians, yes, taking very seriously and caring a lot about their tradition and their symbols, but also maybe saying, well, a lot of that's symbolic and metaphorical. And now we have science and we have a better sense of how all that stuff plays out. And so these scriptures fulfill a different role than all of that, right? And we shouldn't read Genesis as like science. And similarly, like Buddhists, I mean, think of like what the kind of stuff that the Dalai Lama, has written about and stuff, of like bringing in neuroscience and explicitly saying in some cases, like, yeah, if it was shown that reincarnation wasn't real and that was proven to be the case, then like, yeah, we shouldn't believe it. Similarly, like maybe Reformed Judaism and stuff like that, where you got this very modern sensibility that's engaging with the past, but from a sense of, yeah, but not all of that should be taken quote unquote literally, et cetera, right? These are structural parallels that, even though the content is very different, the structures are actually very similar. And so if you think of the modern the pre-modern, the modern, the postmodern as structures, a way of building a bubble or a worldview, right? Like what we were talking about earlier, of like inhabiting that world space, then you can see that the content can be different, but it's the structure that is very similar. And so what a metamodern religion approach to religion looks like, one of the aspects of it is looking at religion specifically through those different structures and trying to understand that potentially as a developmental progression in a way that avoids that postmodern collapse you're talking about. Because the postmoderns will look at all these different worldviews and they'll say, hey, look, like all these people just believe different things, and you believe this, you believe that. And yeah, maybe there's pre-moderns and maybe there's moderns, but who's to say, because it's all relative. The metamodern then comes around and says, no, these are structures of thought, actually, and you can show in a meaningful way that one leads into the next and builds upon the previous one. And if you can show that, then they're not just relative and arbitrary, they actually have a logic to them, an unfolding progression. And if you can show that, you can actually show relative rightness or trueness or accuracy. And this starts to get into your issue about like truth and how do we know what's true and all that.
It's interesting because I think that whatever it was in your conversation with Jordan or even Paul, that I kind of was like, from my vantage point and my experiences, and is that, well, I'll say this. If it felt like the push is like, or the rub seemed to be, you're going backwards, bro. Come on, come forward, come forward. Yeah. And I think what I'm saying is like, no, I actually do think this is forward. And that, so I'm going to say that, okay, do I believe that there's ultimate truth in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ? Yeah. Cards on the table, got a cross on my video. Fine. But your framework, like, is what I'm seeing at the same time of everything that you're talking about. So someone that did this for a living, now, I still do some of that. Now I've started, that's a whole nother story of starting to do that in the last 6 months. But, heavily more, even more, when we hired the guy who went to Yale Divinity, he was a Presbyterian, and we started actually doing formalized liturgy in our rock and roll stuff, like real formalized. And so there's this different structure with this other structure that had been pervasive and part of like something that you could consider like the pinnacle of modernism, modern worship. That phrase is a real phrase, so like, I said, I do have a framework for ultimate truth, right? So, but let's say I don't have certainty about, like, is there some transcendent thing? I can't have certainty. Like, I just have faith. Sure. I can't have certainty though. That Brendan's vision up here could be a reality. I don't believe that, but because I don't have certainty, I just have faith in the thing that I do have faith in. Yeah. But that what I'm seeing across the board in even this little corner subculture community scene, but even writ large in evangelicalism and in historical Christian faith in the United States, at least, but even is a recognition of the structure and where people are on that structure, and even greatly in Jonathan Peugeot's work, when he doesn't say, well, go to the Greek Orthodox Church because this is the highest form of meaning that he believes. He says, go to church. And that maybe with an earnestness, people are working their way up from different structures of meaning within a Christianity, instead of looking at it modernly like, oh, this is wrong and this is wrong, or you're true and I'm true. No, they're all true, but they all fit into something. That's what I see. And so whenever you were talking, I was like, well, I already see that.
That's so interesting. Yeah. So there's so much there. Couple thoughts. One, I think, like, as you were saying, right when you started, as your kind of takeaway is sort of the issue of like, hey man, don't go backwards, gotta go forwards, right? That's a wonderful way of just summarizing the tension that I feel like we're trying to work out in this conversation around metamodern Christianity. So that's right? But I think people will even be confused if they don't have that framework, right? Because in a postmodern context, there is no backwards or forwards, at least explicitly, right? Obviously, people...
if you haven't gotten to the your truth is my truth, then you're
right, exactly.
backwards.
So there's this whole kind of profound, as it's well known, contradiction in terms and performative contradiction going on there. But at least nominally, the idea, right, is that no truth is superior to the other, except maybe the truths that are being more marginalized and oppressed because we should support them and whatever. So in that framework, people don't. What does that even mean? Going forwards and backwards, right? Like. So I think you have to have a kind of context for this developmental lens to some of this stuff, or at least let's just say relative truth, right? That some things are more true than other things, to have that sense. So you're totally right on that front. I also want to make the point that in my vision, and in most metamodern, people who talk about these things, it's not the sense that like these structures are monolithic things that are all consuming, that need to, let's say, kind of take over or colonize everything in life at that particular level. What do I mean by that? I mean, like, I don't think it's particularly valuable if like someone just jumps into a full-on radical modernist perspective from a full-on traditional perspective, right, and then jumps to a full-on radical postmodern, whatever. Like, that could be a particular developmental trajectory for someone, but I think one of the things that we're really trying to deal with is that certain frames and certain perspectives have relative merits in different contexts, right? And I think that this is sort of the big key, and probably a lot of what you're seeing, right, is that like there is a place for the traditional in the meta-modern, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Like the meta-modern angle is not trying to say, oh, you traditionalists, give up tradition. Quite the contrary. It's trying to say, wow, we really need that tradition stuff too. Right? Now, the thing, though, I think is that then the devil's in the details. Like, well, which aspects of tradition and that
always
sort of thing, right? Yeah. So, but I do want to make that case because I do think that we're really grappling with this issue collectively. Is like, what do we do about these old ways of seeing the world, these ancient wisdoms, these ancient psychotechnologies, et cetera, and there's just this resurgence in interest and care and appreciation for these things, in a good way, because we need to integrate these things back into our society. A modern society that doesn't have tradition, family, connection, ritual,
rites of
sacred
passage,
art, all this stuff, it becomes this dystopian nightmare that we're grappling with.
We're there, right?
We're there. We are there, right?
Yeah.
So when people look out and they see, mile upon mile of strip malls and McDonald's and 8-lane highways, that in many ways is the modern world. And we don't want that, or at least I'm just saying as a meta-modern thinker, I don't want that. I find that to be abhorrent. And so what do? We need to take what is good and the best from modern thought and that framework, and we need to carry that into the future. We also need to do the same thing with tradition. And so one of the things that these conversations are doing, that I want them to do, I hope they're doing, is trying to have the negotiation of like, well, what aspects of tradition do we want to carry forward? And I can be very clear about those things, and I can say things like ritual and art and community and all the aspects of living close to the earth and knowing your neighbors and participating in shared events together. Blah blah blah. I could go on and on and on. Personally, what I don't think is something we want to carry forward is an understanding of the mechanics of, let's say, natural processes that I think the modern framework does a better job at communicating, right? So like understanding some of the causal aspects of reality, I think is something that the modern period really did upgrade us on. And it moved us from making a lot of false associations between like, oh, why did, like there's going to be eclipse on the 8th, right? Like before a lot of modern science, we would have we would have,
No, dude,
we would have
cool.
crapped ourselves and we would have been like, oh, no,
This is not this is not a PG YouTube channel at all. It's all right. Yeah, we would shit our pants. Oh no, gods. Oh no.
Yeah. So that's the thing is like we want to get a sense of what to carry forward, what to leave behind. And similarly, like with all these things, with postmodernism too, right? Hey, we need to appreciate context. And actually, Paul Vanderklay and a lot of these folks, Jordan Hall, they're really hip to this stuff. There's actually a surprising amount of postmodern thought in this circle, right? It's this kind of like, it's a critique of modernity that comes a lot of it from the postmodern. So hey, great, good to be aware of that stuff. But we also don't want to carry forward this radical relativism and the skepticism, the anti-realism. It's like, nope, right? So that's a way of thinking about the metamodern relationship to religion. And then we can talk about how it looks in Christianity specifically. But like the point being that we don't just want to leave all of the traditional behind, all the modern behind or whatever. We want to carry it forward, but selectively.
Yeah, so I would say that I could, fully be invested in what I think is the Brendan Dempsey meta religion, but I think this is what can be meta about it is that we can both like step back here like we're doing and be like, well, and we can respect that and that is even a part of the postmodern thing, that it's like, okay. And I think when you've bumped into this space, I guess, so as a practitioner, I'll lay this out. My wife's family, Catholic, Lutheran. I was charismatic Baptist, Presbyterian. So it's like all across the board, high to low, like straight, like the whole thing. Yeah. My wife's aunts were nuns. Her uncle's an archbishop when he retired. So it's like, not just like, oh, I'm Catholic, it's like, we are Catholic. And, so, and then it was like, well, her mom left that for a more personal, like understanding personal relationship with God. Megan, my wife, came to the guy doing like, let's all, that whole thing. I'm coming up the other way. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then work with this Presbyterian. It's like, well, this liturgy is interesting. And so then it's like orienting. And in a 20-year conversation in my marriage with my in-laws about sacramental theology, rites, paedo-baptism, like these things that were foreign to me. It's like, well, how does this all work? Like how, so like I'm like operating in this liminal space in that framework. And then I had to like step back completely and take responsibility for myself and rebuild my life. But at the same time, that stuff is still cooking. Yeah. And so then it's like, well, okay, I do what I am experiencing in this space when I'm, talking to a lot of other Christians from a lot of other places, and we're not like, it's like a meta space because it's like, well, yeah, he goes to Lutheran church and these people are serious Catholics and these people like do rock and roll on Sunday morning and like, yet we're okay. Yeah. And so what I think I wanted to poke or push on was like, so say Brendan's project is true. Okay. Like, let's say that's true. I would want to encourage you to see or to think, I guess, which I think you're brilliant. So I don't want it to come across as like a, hey, dude, you don't get this type thing. Like that's not.
There's
that's
a
not
lot
it.
of things I don't get though.
Okay,
So
well,
I welcome that too.
Is just that to get to the full meta religion, if that's a reality, like Christianity has to become meta itself, and I felt like it's like, come on, dude, get to the program, and I'm saying, well, I think that if you're going to hold on to that Christianity, like the Jordan Halls are going to do a way better job of helping develop a meta Christianity than just saying, well, couldn't we just ascend to the next thing or something? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, it does. It does. Gosh, I think that's all right. And I don't want anyone to have a monopoly on their vision, right? I think that it's good to have a healthy plurality of different takes on what this meta-modern Christianity thing is, meta-religious thing is. And there already is, like, even in the meta-modern conversation, a lot of different ways that people think about this basic idea but apply it differently, right? Like a lot of people want to say, yeah, you should be able to totally toggle into the traditional headspace and then do that on Sunday morning. And then for Monday morning, totally toggle into the modern headspace. And that's one way people think about this. For me, that's always, that generates a lot of cognitive dissonance because we want to also be integrated people and have like a sense that things cohere and hold together. But I do think that, I guess just to speak to that is like, I welcome different approaches to this issue.
I mean, to speak to that, just take rock and roll worship at 9 a.m. on a Sunday morning. It happens all over the world, all over the United States. Like, I would look at that now as be like, well, what if we keep rock and roll at 9 or 8 p.m. on a Friday night? And not right. And not like discredit its value, but like place it in an order where it used to be, well, sex, drug, and rock and roll. Like, okay, no, we're past that. We can see the patterns, even those patterns we were talking about. Aesthetic, where does this fit? Aesthetically, or where does? And then like, okay, but then maybe on a Sunday morning, there's a more sacred, more reverent, because the telos of that space is more than just feeling the bass drum. It's like trying to touch the divine, whether that's the Eucharist or through a holy liturgy or something. So like, that's kind of more how I would say that is it doesn't have to create a cognitive dissonance. That's just like one case study where it's like, but a lot of people, I think, still worry that it would. Like, oh no, if you take away my meaning, this is funny because 20 years ago when I stepped on stage at a Southern Baptist church and I stripped away the meaning for the 60-year-old that had been doing hymns his whole life, when I got up there to play Third Day, and his face turns red and he walks out and I'm like, why doesn't he get it? Like, this is really meaningful to me and this is really important to me. I didn't realize I was like, stamping on deep meaning for him. And it's funny because I kind of feel like the same thing is now happening. It's very modern. Cognitive dissonance, like when I have these conversations about a high telos in worship, there are certain people that are like, well, I don't know. Don't take away my rock and roll, Christian.
Yeah, right.
And no, I don't want to. But that can create dissonance, I think. So that's like on a, that's not incorporating Buddhism. That's not incorporating Hinduism, like on the larger scale. But I'm saying like what I think that I do see though is these like a hierarchy of value and meaning, which doesn't mean that there's no meaning down here, but there's just like the meaning stacks or something.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's so much going on there. I mean, one example I'll give, but there's a number of places that could go with this, but I'll be very like direct, I guess, by what I mean. When Paul was talking about Tammy Peterson's cancer being miraculously healed.
Okay.
That's a propositional claim. and it might be a meaningful one for him and for certain people in their religious outlook. But where it lands for me is that's not how the world works. A lot of modern insight can tell us why. Also, even if, what would you say? Just theologically speaking, that there, as I tried to bring up in that moment, there's so much disconcerting about that notion of this intervening God who's like, oh, but Tammy Peterson's going to get her cancer healed, and all this other stuff going on over here with the war in Gaza and famine and 40,000 kids dying today because of malnutrition. Like, nope, not going to do anything about that. Like just at a theological level, it's profoundly troubling. And again, to go back to kind of tie this back in with how my initial relationship with historical critical stuff was actually really like healing for me. It's similarly here, right? It's like certain updates in our way of thinking about causality can actually resolve us of certain, I think, deeply problematic notions of the divine. So granting there is a divine, let's just take that for granted for the moment, that there is some, profound, ultimate, glorious, good, fundamental thing about reality that we aspire to as the apex of our hierarchy of value. Granting that, right, we also then want to be in accord with, in alignment with that to the best of our ability, understanding how things work and how it works and all that. And so I think that there's, in that sense, a lot that the modern insights about causality can teach us to update certain notions of our theology. And so I would just use that as an example, because if you kind of make that a kind of global movement, and by meaning like you apply that to across the board, across your thought, it puts you in a different place in relationship to reality itself and to understanding the kinds of ways that the divine operates, right? Because like one way is to see things more or less having a certain kind of regularity, except every now and then a kind of God, a whimsical God will just sort of like interrupt natural processes for mysterious, reasons, versus taking the whole shebang, the whole grand, glorious cosmos, that's been evolving over billions of years, this more intricate and complex and, more conscious entities through time, and like taking that as your source point of like, wow, there's something, sublime and grand, right? I guess what I'm saying is that we wind up making the divine so much smaller, I think, if we don't expand it through certain insights of modernity.
So, I mean, just on that point, to try to understand that for you, the historical critical modern work helped deal with theodicy.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, that's kind of how that seems to that I was trying to hold hold the things you were going to go with.
Yeah.
And then and I don't really want to be like, well, what about, or do a but or anything to that.
No,
like
that's
that's
fine.
not,
I think
like,
well, wait, just a meta point on the not wanting a meta point on the wanting to stay meta for a second is like, this is what's fun is that I feel like simultaneously as these communities are coming together and trying to have these conversations, we need to navigate what is it that we want to do, right? There's a certain value and beauty to just sort of listening to other people's perspectives and holding space for that. But I also want to be challenged, and I want, we can grow together and learn from each other. And so,
I think the wanting to drop the modernist debate is kind of like the impulse, because I'll just use this I've used it as an example. And people can cringe at the characters that I'm about to, some people, but like when I saw Ben Shapiro and Rubin in 2016 having a conversation that appeared in good faith, and they were kind of at that point still in fairly different spaces. I wouldn't say that as much now, like with IDW times, the romantic times. I talk about them as
the good old days.
The romantic times. But because of a reaction to ingestment of the modern debate.
Yeah.
Like that was that was a way that didn't make me feel like I couldn't have conversations. And then the postmodern thing that we're still kind of swimming in with, I don't want to use political terms on here but like, that doesn't make me feel like there's space to hold for conversations. And so, meeting you there and be like, well, so back to the theodicy and historical criticism being like, well, if we can have a more transcendent view of God, the divine, then that can encompass that. And I think that, I wouldn't deal with that by pointing to miracles. Personally, I think that I would deal with that saying that there is ultimate justice. That on the face value, Tammy Peterson's healing, doesn't answer the question of justice, and neither does the 40,000 children dying today answer the question of justice. I still think Christianity has an answer for that, in a way that it's true. And then there was something I don't, and I could answer that specifically, through the gospel, through the cross, through this whole, that I don't feel.
Let me just speak real brief to this thing, because I really care about this, and I want to know how to move forward with it. I'm going to be meeting with Paul again next week, and we're going to have another chat. And I want to think about how to switch gears, because I think that what you were just talking about is really important. We want to keep dialogue open. We don't want things to break down along similar fault lines, and the whole dynamic of the new atheist stuff, right? All of that was like not, I don't want to go there. I don't want to be in the role of a Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens just being like, oh, these people are idiots. They're just stupid. It's like, well, wait, no, it's not. There's so much more there, right? So I don't want to do that. At the same time, again, I go back to what was a real catalyst for my own growth and spiritual change, which was some dude on the internet telling me things I'd never even heard of or thought of before. What the heck is Deutero-Isaiah, right? And
I don't know.
But so like there's also value in getting that challenge and back a little bit. So you still with me? I lost you for a second.
Yeah, it was kind of clunky.
Oh, okay. But yeah, just that there is also this value that there's a function I think we can perform for each other in this space with different maybe strengths, right? Like I might, despite having come from a traditional religious background, my strengths might now be much more in that modern perspective. And other people's will be in that traditional perspective. Other people's will be in the postmodern perspective. And if we can maybe do some synergy amongst ourselves, then I think we can do this sort of beautiful dance where there isn't just one person's vision that's won out. It is this sort of like really dynamic, maybe even a dynamic tension, but even some opponent processing maybe in like Vervaeke terms, where we're holding something really beautiful together because we're all balancing each other. And that can't happen if we just get siloed into these different modalities and these different worldview frames. But I feel like a meta-modern Christianity, if it's gonna somehow be dancing with the pre-modern, the modern, and the postmodern, has to have that modern aspect in there. And so, yeah, my worry simultaneously is that the modern critical stuff gets left out, or that in the effort to bring it back in, it just devolves into the old kind of modernism versus fundamentalism debate, which is like, So anyway, I share that concern, and I welcome thoughts or feedback. I don't know. I mean, like, I think what we're doing right now is pretty good. I think we're
I do feel care and respect, and as we were able to do each other's story and be like, yeah, dude, I like,
yeah.
And that's the difference between, just hopping on the debate stage and just going at your thing. It's like, well, okay, we actually understand each other quite a bit, in certain ways. So let me see if I can get back to the rub or the opponent processing in okay, so how do you take the modern, like, so you're saying my strength is like, I know this thing. I know the historical critical thing well, which is obviously true. And I don't. So, but I'm familiar enough with it, was exposed to it. And probably didn't take it super seriously, to be honest, but it wasn't for me. Hearing those things didn't break me apart. Something else did. So, but I would say, well, okay, here's what I want to, sorry, this is taking me a second to kind of get there.
Good.
It is important for, say, people who, and this might be this might be the thing that's giving you pause. Let me see if I can dial in on it.
Sure. That
the new convert or the post Jordan Peterson convert, this stuff's just going to come back up to them, and and it's like, this was here, and I wish somebody would have told you about this, and so that this didn't have to be as painful, but there's also a path forward, that kind of thing. It seems like that's what you're wanting to bring to that conversation, which I do think is important. Like, let people see the historical criticism very clearly, so that they can have an informed view. I would just say, for me personally, that is less important now, because I do think that the framework, the structure, as we both can agree on, that's so broken in our culture and our society, that historical, scriptural, devotional, offers me as a person, offers my marriage, offers my children, even offers my community, it's available now. I guess. And I live I was thinking about this coming into this conversation, that knowing that you were from Vermont, and we already addressed this, but I was like, I still live in a little bit of the Christendom, in the Bible Belt world. Yeah. And so that seems, maybe that fits more readily in a certain way.
Sure.
Than where you are, this is a part of the conversation I actually was interested in, and I don't know how much time you have left, but is what you're actually doing now. And you have come in and taken leadership, I think, of Sky Retreat. No, sorry.
Sky Meadow. Yeah. Of
Sky Meadow, and it's a place where people can come and find those things, I think. It seems like. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, no, lots of good stuff in there. Let's start here by saying this. Like, okay, so I with my wife, when we sit down to eat dinner, we pray. Say, "Dear God, thank you so much for this food," and all this stuff, right? We do that. I have an altar with a Jesus on it. He's like the featured. I mean, it's a meditating Jesus, but it's a Jesus.
It's symbolic. It sounds like
it is. Yes, very much. And I could say a lot more about that.
If you said he's meditative, then that's symbolic of some things. Yeah.
Yeah, and for me, saying something is metaphorical or symbolic, though I know these words are apparently used with great distinction sometimes. That to me is, I guess, not a bad thing in any way. Like, it's a very wonderful and magical thing that we can use language in different ways and connect to the transcendent by means of that sort of thing. But I just bring those two things up because these are, just to go back to the saying grace bit. Like, I basically say grace the exact same way I used to say grace when I was
growing up.
10 years old, right? Well, I guess I just want to gesture that towards the idea that, like, you can still do that, but it takes on a slightly different flavor, different meaning. Your relationship to it is different because you see the world differently. Whereas before I might have thought that, like, in a kind of admittedly, from my own perspective, a very confused way that like, well, I'm praying and then I'm praying to someone, and who am I praying to? Well, there's God, but he's in cloudy heaven area, which is some file far away, but also immediately here, so he can hear me. And right, like if you actually like really think about it, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to a child's mentality of what they're praying to and all that. Now, I still do the exact same thing, but I allow that to also just be confused. Just allow it to be like, I don't have to have an explanation for this, right? I don't have to, but I can also see the value in doing it, of saying thanks, of being in relationship to the transcendent in that moment, and marking out one particular point of the day in which there is some kind of a specialness. Oh, did I freeze? Let me know.
No, sorry. I was just like,
oh, okay.
focusing.
You were like really still. I was like, oh, he froze. Okay. No, that's very attentive. So, so anyway, point being and all that is, I don't want people to mistake that what I'm getting at is that like certain kinds of practice or even certain modes of faith become impossible on the other side of a historical critical engagement. They just become transfigured, right? There's some different way that they're operating. And I think that the big thing that I get concerned about is that people won't know what that mode is like, right? That like that people will remain in a more. I don't.
It's all right. Go for
like,
it. It's okay.
Well, like, okay, I want to use the It's going to sound pejorative, but please bear with me. I don't mean this isn't anything negative, but like when I was in that state as a kid, I was naive, I would say, because I hadn't interrogated a lot, and there was a kind of naivete to my sense of all of this stuff. Going through the historical critical stuff and the modern relationship to this content robs you of that naivete very violently in some cases, especially if you've invested a lot in a certain form of interpretation of that material in a certain way. But then what I think this metamodern approach invites people to do, is find a second naivete, to allow themselves on the other side to still engage with these things, but just...
You're not talking about a childlike faith, though. You're not...
But I'm not talking about a childlike faith, and that's the whole thing, right? There's a second naivete where simultaneously that if someone were to show up, if Richard Dawkins poofs out of the sky and he says, "What are you doing? Like, explain yourself," right? You wouldn't be able to explain yourself, right? Like when a family member of mine is traveling, I was, "Oh, dear God, please keep them safe on the roads," or whatever, I have no recourse to anything else in this moment, and this wants to come out of me, and so I do it, right? And if Richard, my Richard Dawkins genie shows up and says, "Oh no, what are you doing now?" Right?
Yeah.
So the metamodern, I think, invites people to be okay with this aspect of living as a human being in the world, to not always operate from the rational propositional aspect of reality, but they toggle, right? So that if I am to enter into a conversation now with someone about, Jesus and what all that means, I can toggle back to that other thing, and I know all this other historical stuff that then sets in context this other modality of my life. And that's the point, is that being able to do that toggling changes all the different modes you enter, right? It's sort of like, how people do code switching, right? Like if you grow up in one environment and you learn to speak one particular language, that's the only world you know. If you have another opportunity to learn another language and then kind of embrace a whole other culture, this becomes a whole new part of you. And then you can toggle in and out and see and compare and contrast. But by virtue of the fact that now you have multiple worlds that you can relate, you're not stuck with one world. And so my concern is that a strictly traditional devotional approach to Christianity will be stuck with one world, and thus prone to certain pathologies that multiple worlds could help loosen and make more healthy. So I just wanted
that makes sense. I mean, I would say that I think that what Jordan Peterson did, was because you brought in this idea of language. He was able to take a certain language, like certain modern language, and then with Jonathan Pinjot actually attach that to the kind of ancient or medieval even conversation of these things that then created a synthesis that allowed people to drop out of their atheism back into Christianity to varying different degrees. That, however, the meta-modern thing that I'm experiencing, because what happened for me, I was fired in 2016. What else happened in 2016? It's Peterson.
A few things.
A lot of things. So it's like, and he was kind of like a guide along the way, because there was also things he talked about personal integrity and all this kind of stuff, and rebuilding your life and picking up a load and all, so, but the language, so me dropping back into participating in some sort of service and leadership to a religious life, a Christian religious life, but also entering into conversations with people from all the different stripes is like, and even with what we're doing, but to look at the person that's still, and maybe, never might ever get into this, even what I might consider a higher form of consciousness when it comes to Christianity or something, but like be able to speak with them with respect, even from that they are still in a scriptural devotional, which I don't even know if I am or not, that's fine. But like, have to be able to respect that and even say, hey, I was raised this way. And even though there was, you and I can, go into bed in tears, having conversations about the end of the world. Like I have problems with that. And, and I have conversations with people now about that. Let's not talk about that around the kids. I'll have that conversation with you, or something like that. And I can meet you there. But, so being able to dialogue with people in that space. But I also think that people that are coming into this space through this medium, which is Jordan Hall and the Peterson pipeline, like downstream from that, from New Atheism, I think that they do have a language that is transcendent from and won't just, some people will, but like fall into like, I'm just going to pick up the Christianese jargon. I don't know. I don't see that as the case very much in this world.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I agree with a lot of that. I guess, yeah, maybe the last thing I'll say on that front is there's a particular mode of Christianity that I see as possible, let's say, that interprets the Christian tradition as a story of coming to communion with God in such a way that expands to include the entire universe, in such a way that all of the grandeur that we know from history and from science, everything we know about chemistry and biology, is part of a sort of cosmic unfolding that is leading to that communion with some grand, good, holistic, beautiful, kind, compassionate, human, more than human thing. And I think that you can render all of the traditional images and symbols in those terms. And I think you could go to church and you could relate to God as that. You could even relate to the God on the cross as being that continually evolving, transforming conception of the divine that God is always breaking out of and reforming and breaking out of, and that human beings are always sort of successively learning about more and more and coming to express more and more on our way towards that grand communion. And you can look at the entire history of evolution as being this meaningful, significant, incredible journey, et cetera, et cetera. I think all that's very possible, and even framing that as Christianity, that this is sort of a particular new kind of way of thinking about Christianity. And there have already been people in this vein, Teilhard de Chardin and other people who've kind of thought in these terms. And in my conception of that Christianity, if someone says, did Jesus, cast out demons from people to heal their diseases? Like the most immediate answer without a problem would be, well, no, that's not didn't happen, or that's not to be understood as like what that's ultimately about, or why that's even significant, and that not causing any uncomfort, right? Or causing any sense of like, like I'm not being true to the tradition, or oh, I guess I've watered down my faith so much that, now I'm relating to this as just like a story or something. That there's a form of relating to these stories as just stories, but incredibly also meaningful for the way that they gesture to something grand and true. That to me is a form of Christianity that I think is possible, but I don't see that much out in the world, at least, in some of the contexts that you just named, because in those contexts where you just do push back a little bit about, well, did that actually happen? And it's like, well, yes, it did. And it's very important that and it's like, oh, okay, that's fine. That is totally fine. But that is not the only way that, and I don't think anyone, and to be clear, I don't think anyone's saying this is the only way that this can be approached. But do you see what I'm saying? I want to.
Yeah, I think so. So I'm trying to, because there was a comment, I think we talked about, we engaged with briefly about exclusive. And I think that's where, obviously, this is the rub, that's the rub. I mean, and that would be, I don't know if that just is all of a sudden, when that is the rub, that you are in the scriptural devotional versus something else or something like that, historical critical.
Well, wait, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Sorry, just quick question. I think there's a little bit of a delay. Actually, because you were mentioning earlier that like you feel this profound sense of like brotherhood in this scene of like, well, yeah, you're a Christian and you're Eastern Orthodox and but you feel like there's this pluralism to all that, where people are sort of like, yeah, but we kind of get each other and it's sort of a thing. I guess my question is, does that extend beyond Christianity? Does it extend to other people? Like if someone is, say, a Buddhist,
that would be, sure. So to answer that is like, okay, well, I think that there are two ways of looking that I don't know if they will both fit into a type of orthodoxy. From my perspective, my limited perspective, one would be that there are certain forms of Christian universalism, that there is an ultimate redemption, but that exclusively happens through Jesus Christ, like through the incarnation, and then also through the death and resurrection. So I think, and I don't know if there's a place, and so there's that side, but then there's also, well, is there a more orthodox side that's like, well, do we believe in an actual resurrection? Do we believe in an actual virgin birth? Do we believe that it's possible that story of Jesus and the pigs or something did happen, and then that's a commonality? I would just say that I think there's just gonna be space for both. Where there's a more, we can't stop that anymore. And what I experience with having conversations, so say I am in this kind of Apostles' Creed Christianity or something, even within the Orthodox in the West, there's this little well, that's fine. But like, even in that, there's like, well, we're not divided by walls anymore. And then even to have this conversation with you to say, okay, well, maybe in some, even to just say, I don't know, like, I don't feel like I have to have a lot of, and maybe that's not respectable, especially if you're coming at it from a historical critical perspective. Well, like, you need to like know what you believe. I think in the same way that the personal experience of the traumas that inform our faith now, like that's actually more important to me than the source criticism.
Sure.
And so, but I can say, yeah, I know about that stuff. And I don't know about it as well as Brendan Dempsey at all. I would say maybe go talk to him. And I think that you would be gentle with somebody in a way because because of how intense it was for you. So it's, it's like, I don't know. I don't know if that's answering your question. And I don't think I'm trying to skirt around it. So
Well, I'll say briefly too, like, I hope people don't get the impression that I'm suggesting anyone who would be a Christian needs to go read, a bunch of source criticism or something. I don't, that's not for me what matters. I think it ultimately all boiled down to, it's just a matter of, like having a sense of taking certain ways of knowing seriously, and not being closed to them, and also being open to the fact that, I mean, I think that the spiritual journey is a kind of punctuated equilibrium of worldview busting. You know what I mean? Like, I think that, at least that's been my experience.
Yeah.
And I feel like, I mean, I'd be curious how you would relate to the idea, having gone through your experience. Like,
it
how would you say
completely,
this?
I would say that the propositional dissolved. But I mean, I still think that I stand on, I operate with propositions. Like I said, I believe in a literal Jesus Christ and a literal resurrection or real resurrection. Like, yeah, because, but I think I believe in it more because it happened in my life.
Yeah.
And that what that represents.
Yeah.
You know, that's actually, and that is a true framework in which that makes complete sense, in the meaning crisis or whatever for me. And but it is informed by a whole life of Christianity. And, I'm a small town guy from Arkansas. I haven't had a lot of great exposure to the world religions, multiculturalism on a certain level. I traveled quite a bit and spent summers in California and Florida and different places, and traveled outside the United States a couple of times, but not lived in metropolitan, super multicultural centers or whatnot, but are religiously diverse, so I don't bring that as an experience. And so that could, well, you just haven't seen enough of the world, Baxter. Okay, that might be true, but this is still like foundational for me.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also, to that point too, I think it's a very unreasonable notion that someone needs to be intimately aware with some or all of the world, religions in order to,
well, that's kind of a modern and a postmodern idea, I think. And to that point, finding an antidote to the meaning crisis and being able to land, like what makes sense to land. And I'm not saying that it's relative, but it kind of is. Like, where am I? What is my life? What is my community? Yeah. What is my history?
Yeah.
Like, and not only that, even the point about like being able to factually intake all the religions or all the cultures, like that is a new phenomenon. Like only the great adventurers were able to do that until the encyclopedia. And even at that point, now it's a YouTube search, but it's like, I think I wanted to mention this to you. It seems like humanity is so far outpaced by our technology, because sometimes when I think about the religious practice, like even like our most divine or high forms of liturgy, which are really complex, they are, they're kind of simple in a way in comparison when you compare it to insane architecture, or even though, I mean, you can look back at historical, I don't know if I'm saying this right, like worship and doing a rites of passage for a young man and doing having communal experience, small group community experiences, and these things, they're kind of simple.
Sure.
Versus this giant thing of the world. And I know that kind of touches on some relativity or whatever, but this is where I can land, and this is where I can like cultivate deep meaning into my family. Yeah. I can cultivate wisdom. I can cultivate ideas about what is true. And yeah.
No, I think that that's great. I think everything you just said is wonderful, and I would totally agree with it. And I think, and briefly when I talked to Paul Anleitner about this a bit, he kind of made a very similar point, and I think it's a really important one, right? Which is that we can't live on all of the islands, right? We could navigate to all the different islands, and we could hypothetically, well, no, I mean, this is the point. We couldn't hypothetically live all those lives. Like,
yeah.
we see that that other people are living other lives. We see that other people are inhabiting other worldviews, and we can get a sense of that. But everyone has to have the spot from which they operate. And if you're going to operate deeply in a spot, which people should try to do, that's a good thing to do, then you've got to go deep into whatever your spot is and basically say, I'm not these other things. I think what's the key about it, though, is that you're aware of that move, right? There's a profound difference between someone who says what you said and someone who says, well, I'm a Christian and that's just the way it is and it's right and all these other people are just simply wrong and I'm not even gonna, you know what I mean? Like, even, you know what I mean? Like, because even if there's a certain way to which you kind of come down ultimately in something very similar in the end, which is to say, well, I am a Christian and I do think that this is the ultimate truth and I do think this is the way. Just having the awareness that we're kind of pushed into declaring in almost a somewhat relativistic way our, flag in the ground where we stand makes us more tolerant, more open, more kind of like less domineering and less closed-minded, right? We're like, I could have been something else maybe if I'd been born somewhere else, but I was born here, so I'm going to own that. And so when you do meet someone who was born from somewhere else, you're not as inclined to treat them so radically as an other and as a wrong and as a this and that. So I just think that all of that is like one way in which some of the profound truths of tradition can really meaningfully show up in a meta-modern orientation towards Christianity in this case, right? By specifically coming through the insights of postmodernism, which is, oh my gosh, there are other worldviews and et cetera, et cetera. So I just wanted to say that I think that's a good thing. People should be like, hell yeah, I'm a Christian and I celebrate that. And people shouldn't make apologies about being any particular religion. Yeah.
Well, so I've got about 5 minutes, and to that point, where have you landed?
I would need at least 6. Yeah, well, I have landed to tie up that loose end. I have landed at Sky Meadow, and this is a place where we are a bit experimental. We're interested in doing emergent ritual, and we're trying to speaking of having ground and putting a flag somewhere, right? Like, this is a place, and there's gardens, and there's animals, and this is like it's so important to feel rooted, and people need that, and we should be seeking that out very intentionally, to feel rooted, to have traditions. So this is a place where we have meta-modern spirituality gatherings twice a year. People have a kind of traditional sense of that. We're coming and we're exploring these things together collectively. So that's literally where I've landed. But spiritually, where I've landed is in a place that feels very healthy and wholesome and full for me. And very life affirming and very seems to be is helping me to flourish. And so all those things I do use as good signposts for, assessing where I'm at. And it's a form of looking at reality as much as we can have a sense of it through all of the different insights of all the different cultural codes, and trying to see that as a really meaningful story that's still evolving and ongoing. And yeah, I mean, if people want to hear me talk more about that, they can check out my YouTube channel, and there's stuff on there where I've said more about all that. I wrote a book called Emergentism, which is sort of my take on this. So yeah, I could say a lot more, but I've landed in a place where I'm excited for what comes next, and I'm excited to see where the rest of these conversations develop to. And I very much appreciate this opportunity. I had a lot of fun.
Thank you, Brendan. And I'll hit this bumper and we'll end this thing backstage, man. Sound good? All right, man.
Sounds good, my friend. Appreciate it.
Hi, this is Christian Baxter, and you're listening to Yours Truly, a place we go to think out loud.